Hello? Yeah.
Hey, Bradley.
Hi.
Funny. Hey, Bradley. They do a lot of like their music video for Loneliness is very funny to me. Like it's very, it kind of they kind of make fun of themselves, and it was interesting. I actually they're coming to Boston, and I might try to see them. So we'll see.
Cool.
Anyway, and if you're coming to Boston too, Bradley, I'll try to see you. So how are you this morning?
Oh, pretty good. Pretty good. I'm probably not going to Boston, but
I don't think, especially now.
so yeah. So how's everyone doing? Looks like we've got our.
Well, we're all wearing primary colored, solid color shirts.
Yes.
Please, oh, no, what happened here?
What are the odds?
Or RGB, or
No, our
Yeah. Blue, yellow, and red. Yes. It's not really primary colors, but yeah, I get your point.
right.
But yeah, it's could just use the name of the shirt, you know.
This will be great. Come join our super nerd lab. Every week we show up in primary colors. I feel. Oh, also Brian. Curtain wire to hang curtains.
Oh.
It's happening. It's gonna happen. I'm at my desk now. I'm like, things are coming along. I've kept most of my promises, other than my diagrams said it'll be really bad. Got to show bad diagrams to say I thought about it, and I think the most minimalist progress possible. Just had something to show.
I like that diagram behind you. It just says Norbert, and then it's pointing to, what is that? Overella. Norbert.
That's pretty much. That's basically my subconscious is like, how do we go from here to here?
Yeah.
I think I wrote that somewhere during our talks before, and then
yeah, I noticed it the other day. I was like, oh, that's nice.
Here's what I'm trying to do. Just one line. That's it.
That's it.
So I don't know who else is going to show up today. Why don't we go give updates, and then we can get. And Jesse, I know you wanted to talk about another topic, but we can do that after. We can do that later.
What was the topic? I totally forgot. I know I wrote about it somewhere.
It's in the general channel of the Slack.
Oh yeah, okay. That's going to be kind of a professional development-y kind of talk or something.
Yeah.
I forgot to look at Slack recently, so.
Well, I'll be right back. I'm going to clean off my glasses.
All right, yeah. So Jesse, how are you? Your update for the week? What have you been up to?
You know, I have not a lot of fun things to say, but it's been a good week for me personally. I think I got a haircut. I know this is like trivial, but I felt the need to wear hats for a long time, and it's not a perfect day or whatever. Like, I feel okay, and I feel like this week has been I kind of mentioned before Boston when I got sick. Boston was, before going to Chicago, I was such a difficult and crazy time. And Chicago itself there was a lot going on. It was great to see you and Avery and all that other stuff. And I saw Jenny there, and things happened. That was great. But now I feel like, okay, I'm back from Chicago. I have my summer kind of flowing in an order. I've invested a bit into like my office and my space to try to have a bit more of a functional space to do what I need to do. And I feel like things are finally kind of coming to. I feel like I'm on the highway. Like I've gotten onto I've been waiting at the red light and got onto the on ramp, and now I'm on the highway, and I'm slowly actually accelerating up to like actual speed. So I feel it's been a lot of like little concrete, mundane stuff that isn't writing great papers,
Yeah.
but it's like the foundational things you have to get there. And so I feel really good about doing that and trying to intentionally invest in the production capacity of my space and life and stuff like that. And I was joking. I said I showed Brian like my curtain things arrived. One of my I'm gonna use like a wire rod instead of a straight rod. I'm gonna use a wire that you can make really taut and use that way to hang different stuff up and section off things. So, and this is like all more like mundane, concrete stuff. But between that happening and still with conversations and still pushing ideas forward and still doing the stuff I need to do for WeRobot, it's been good. It's been a good week. I feel kind of restored after a very, very, very draining period.
Yeah.
So I feel good. As far as other like specific updates, I'm really happy with Cognition Futures. The stuff we've talked about, the blog posts we've talked about. I know Amanda won't be here today, but it's been great to talk to her. It's been great to talk to everybody in the group and kind of. I really like the energy of what we're doing with that, and I'm so thankful. I was actually I forgot who I was telling this week, one of my friends, or maybe Avery or something, but just like having that three other very bright, concerned people looking at text with me is a treat because we're all kind of looking at in the same stuff. But this is going really well, and I look forward to the putting. I haven't had much time, but I have time this weekend to really put some. And we can go in this depth later, but putting some structure to both the methodology paper and also kind of the methodology project, like some boilerplate stuff or a one pager or something I can show to other people saying, hey, we have this project going on. Would you like to be an intern and help us out here? Would you like to be a philosophy intern looking at XYZ? Are you in linguistics? And kind of, I was like, oh, we can start doing some interview kind of stuff or whatever. And I appreciate like Brian was kind of into that and looking at people that we can start make it less of an idea and more like getting some real stuff and even to the place where having enough structure that we could have it, having enough project administration structure such that we can really engage externally, because internally we know everything, but outside of me talking right now, or I made a joke with my friends like, oh, we should all, because we're like Avery and other folks and I went for a group that's totally distributed, just like the lab, and saying, oh, we should watch something together soon, right, through internet.
Yeah.
And I was like, I made a joke, and I'm very proud of it, and I'll say it here again. Obviously, like I know everybody really wants to watch replays of the Cognition Futures reading group, but maybe we shouldn't do that right now. But I feel like that's basically all I can show to external people is like, well, we have this. Here's a video.
Yeah.
I don't have anything on a website here. Please look at this and look at what we're doing, what we're reading. I could show them Amanda's notes, but that's not really presentable to other people. Nothing against what we're doing there, but like getting to a place where you can actually demo to other people enough that they are excited about it and say, oh, yeah, I this looks great. I'd be happy to interview you. And you can write an email, but like having something enough structure just to do that, like that's a thing for sure. So I'm very excited about the methodology project in that sense, and even see it as a personal similar to the future developmental AI stuff that will be coming up to later on. I I think part of my sense of a researcher is evolving a bit in I think I'm finally starting to get enough context to know, like, okay, here's a broad field, or like particularly in interdisciplinary stuff, as we always talk about, here's enough stuff I want to like put, it sounds a bit gruesome, like put hooks in or connect, and then take this like almost like Photoshop with a magic lasso, like, all right, here's a circle, I want to take all the stuff and then move it. I want to go in this direction with it. And I feel like with the methodology project that's taking actual form, with the Dev AI stuff, that'll be a different version of it, but I feel like I'm preparing myself mentally for that. And then the WeRobot stuff is sort of this more immediate, like concrete stuff you do in the meantime. That's adjacent to that. But like I feel like everything about that stuff is I feel really good about that. As I'm being very exuberant and happy this morning about it. But that's kind of I think that's my update in general. And then yeah, I had I'm looking at the Slack, and we'll go to that later, but I had an interesting experience this week that led to the Slack comment. I haven't heard from Rashab this week though. They were kind of they had a proposal they wrote when we looked at it, and I think it went well, but I kind of hope I would love to have them talk more about that themselves in the lab. So no word yet from that, but hopefully soon. Yeah, that's planning for me probably. So.
This was something Rashab shared with you, like proposal wise, or was it?
Yeah, they are. He is. I'm not at liberty to say probably a lot of stuff, but they were asking me, hey, could you look this over? And they were very like, yeah, I'd love to talk about this at the lab too. So I think they're still interested in doing that. I don't know what or when, but you know, I think if you know, it's something that could happen, but it's currently in the realm of the no deadline, no concrete thing happening.
Right. Well, we should meet separately probably for that, just to go, you know. But yeah, whenever he has time, I don't know.
Yeah, I basically like the door's open, and I encourage them to reach out to you or anything else. So, but that's kind of the second. I think that's what I basically said in the second half of the thing. Yeah, in the second half of the comment, it was basically trying to leave the door open for them, and yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for the update. Yeah, well, we can come back to some of the stuff in the first part of that comment later, just in terms of So, Brian, how's your?
How do you feel for NeuroMatch?
Yeah, NeuroMatch is a lot of fun. I think they said that in the past they hadn't done this project aspect of it that they're doing this year, and the project aspect of it, when I first looked at the schedule, said, we'll take one project day per week, and that'll be the day where we work on our projects. And so I thought, that sounds nice. But for some reason, once we started, it became, no, we're going to wake up every morning and work from 9 to 1 p.m. on our project, and then we're going to do a tutorial until 5:30. So it's kind of, NeuroMatch is great, but it's a bit much. Yeah, go ahead.
That's why I can't do it this year. Because and at least in the computational neuroscience stuff, that's exactly what it was. And I did that fully a couple years ago when it first came out. And it was the morning, and then the project stuff was every day. And it's like that was like, oof, like I can't, particularly when the heart of it, the tutorials were like right at some major work stuff. It was like, oh, like I can't make this work. But it is a lot, and I'm curious to like hear about projects that if you want to go there, but
Sure.
So.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, I'm glad they're doing the project thing. And I'm glad that it's only 3 weeks because I got other stuff to do.
Because you want to live.
Yeah.
It's my summer. Yeah.
But the project we're working on here, if you want, I can even show you some of it. We've got it to a state now where it's doing something. It's not quite working yet. But you know what? It's probably going to take too long to load. But here, I'll share my screen anyway, and I'll just show you the project that our group is working on. And I don't feel bad showing it to you because I've done most of the work on it. So here, maybe this. There we go.
There we go.
So basically, what we're doing is we're doing a cognitive task. And one of our group members is really interested in this difference between neurotypical memory and reward, like performance, like attention, all those things that I just mentioned, in children with and without ADHD. But because she was so excited about it, we were like, okay, well, great, we can start there. So we basically found a data set. Here, I guess. Found a data set in this paper here, which I didn't really look too deeply into, but one of the other members of our group is more of a neuroscience like lab person, so she kind of vetted the data for us, so I'm trusting her on that. But so basically what we do is we import it, and we're using reinforcement learning to kind of train an agent to perform the NBAC test. Do you both know what the NBAC test is? I've never heard of it before.
Yeah, it's like you choose from a couple of different alternatives.
Right, yeah. So yeah, they have, it's like here, let's see, I think I wrote it out here. So there's a possible sequence of letters, and you're supposed to kind of pick whether that same letter that you're looking at now appeared a couple trials ago or not.
Right.
That's basically it. So N back would be that the letter appeared 2 back. 1 back would be that the letter just appeared and seeing it again. So it's like a way to measure attention quantitatively. And so these are kind of just some graphs showing that our data set's loaded appropriately. And then we use this DeepMind Acme library to kind of start a reinforcement learning environment and train our agents. And then, interesting. Things have morphed since I last looked at this. So since we're using deep learning, the results are always kind of different. Wow, this is really different than when I just ran it. Okay, anyway, I gotta go back to this. So it's very fascinating working with other people to figure out how to lay this stuff out, how to program it, how to think about it, how to conceptualize it, all that kind of thing. So that's been really interesting. Yeah. So.
Hi, Sam.
Hi.
So I could read that.
Well, that looks great. So the reinforcement learning output is. Could you share your screen again? I wanted to see some of the graphs.
Yeah. Sorry, I kind of stopped before we got to the meat of it.
All right. So yeah. So this is episode count, episode return. So when these graphs are being generated, what are they generating?
So we make these environment loops where we put an agent, in this case the neurotypical agent, into the environment of the neurotypical data. So if a neurotypical person takes this NBAC test, they generate a lot of data, and we put that into our environment and then train an agent within that environment and see how they do, basically. And I'm not sure if we're doing this correctly, right? Because it's reinforcement learning turns out to be an incredibly complex field. Who knew? It's incredibly complex. But the idea that we're doing is that we first train our agents in the environments that correspond to humans that match our agents. So we train a neurotypical agent in a neurotypical environment, and then we train an ADHD agent in an ADHD environment, and then we swap them and see if there's a reliable difference. Oh, I see what happened here. So they increased the episode count, so it's not as obvious how it changes. But before I was running this on, never mind. All right, sorry. I'll have to run all the setup stuff to make this actually work. But yeah, the idea is to kind of compare the way that an ADHD agent does in a neurotypical environment. It's kind of like see what the difference is and try to look at generalizations and differences in reward and loss functions and stuff.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty good. That's nice to see that you're able to get a project off the ground. And so I'm mentoring a project for the other neuromatch, which is the computational neuroscience.
Mm-hmm.
And, they're working on a project that they're interested in ocular dominance columns in vision. So, like the visual cortex V1 has these different columns. Sometimes they're stripes, they're striped orientation. Sometimes in some species they have a salt and pepper orientation, which is like spots. And so the idea is that, they want to look at those types of patterns and they want to replicate them with a artificial neural network. And so they're kind of going back to some biological data, one of the data sets that they have for the students, and then they're going to apply them to, I think, a spiking neural network model and an artificial neural network model. And so then they're going to pull out the relevant results. And we've been working through how to set up the experiments and the comparisons and how to work with data and how to, what to say about it. I've mentored this area before, so there have been a number of student projects in NeuroMatch on comparing artificial neural networks to biological networks, which are our brains. And so I did this last year. I think we had a project or two on it, and then this year we have a project. So it's like a little specialty of mine now. Just supervising some of these projects, trying to figure out the language to use, because there's a lot of language you're pulling together, a lot of different things, and if you're in these two different fields, they'll use terms that are maybe not synonymous, but they're basically the same word. And so, you want to make sure, and plus you want to make sure that there's this, you're not overreaching with respect to what you're saying about the artificial neural network. It's not that it's like a biological network exactly in the same way. There are differences. And then, what are we over-interpreting our results from the simulation? Are we understanding what's going on in the biological system and so forth? So that's the kind of thing that I like, that basic paradigm of looking between the two different systems. So last year they were actually looking at a deep learning network, and they were looking at the different layers of the deep learning network, and then looking at different layers of a brain network that was derived from neuroimaging data. So they had a visual task, and then they'd have a visual task that they train the artificial neural network on, and they'd look at the different layers to see what the statistics were for each. There's a technique you can use where you basically take the data, you put it into a matrix, you calculate correlations for each layer, and then you can compare and see what the layers are doing. It's a nice analysis, but it's also kind of contrived in the sense that they're not really equivalent. So, it was interesting to see what the deep learning network was doing. You have several layers, and the idea in deep learning is that the more layers you have, the better the performance. But no one really knows why, although people are studying that. And it's nice to be able to go layer by layer and see kind of what that corresponds to, maybe in a biological network, where we kind of know what it's doing, at least in terms of the order of processing. So we know that the upper layers, or the first layers, are the ones that deal with sort of the basic shape of things. And then as you get deeper into the network, it's pulling things together, it's integrating. So, we know those kind of things. How does a deep network compare? So this is an open area. No one really, there are a lot of ways you could do this, comparing data from a brain network or some set of pathways in the brain, in the human brain, or even in animal brains like mouse or, other mammals, and then a deep learning network. So that's my neural match update for this week.
Wow. Yeah, and that's great. They came up with us too, and I had never heard of the term ablation before that.
Ablation,
really, really interesting. I think we talked about this. Was it last week?
Yeah, last week.
But yeah, fascinating stuff.
But yeah, it's that's one of the things about these computational neuroscience, and I'll go over some of the things for week 2 in that in a bit. But I don't know, in the deep learning course, I wonder how much different it is, because I know you only taken the deep learning course, and Jesse's taken the computational neuroscience course. Did you ever take the deep learning course, Jesse?
I was supposed to the last 2 years and did not. So I'm a neuromatch delinquent, and that's an ND, and not just neurodivergent either. But no, but it does look quite similar. It's actually kind of funny because I switched projects when I did neuromatch. But I don't know if it was in Bradley's one or in the one before it. We did use the NBAC. The NBAC test was something we were looking at, or at least thinking about looking at when we were doing. It was something cognitive related, and someone was really enthusiastic about stuff in kind of a similar way that way. So it feels actually quite familiar and congruent to the experience, and definitely the structure itself is the same. The project time, tutorial time, and discussion time, that's the same format for sure. And they also have the matching component where you match with stuff. That was kind of a hit or miss for me, but it was good.
I think they gave up on that, and that was originally the thing they wanted to do.
That's why it was called neuromatch, because we have a matching algorithm that will pair you up with these people. They're not doing that anymore.
Kind of to distribute the projects and the mentors, maybe.
You're right. I didn't receive anything about my matches. I did get matched with my group though, so maybe they're just kind of segued into that. But anyway,
yeah, you're right. That would be interesting if they actually gave you the information from the algorithm, from an explainable AI perspective. This is how it matched you based on.
I think they actually have been open about that in the past. I'm sure you could actually find that somewhere if you want, or maybe it's somewhere in their GitHub stuff, or if you honestly ask someone for it. Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, my original inquiry was how much different is the deep learning and the computational neuroscience? Is it a subset or a new different thing?
It looks fairly. There's definitely overlap, but from what I can tell, at least from my brief glance at the coursework, there's just less. I don't know how much you're focusing on neuroscience topics at all, straight neuroscience, Brian. But
they come up whenever they can, and whenever they do, I kind of look over at the neuromatch list of tutorials and topics, and there's a lot of overlap. For example, right now, or the last day, yesterday, we did time series and natural language processing. And on the same day in the computational neuroscience class, they did dynamic networks. So there's a lot of, it's very similar in the way that it works in terms of its form.
Yeah. I didn't see anything in the deep learning coursework that was super. I imagine just the emphasis and how much they're going into it is different, but it can feel radically different.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's imagine that there's deep learning components or coding components, and then there's neuroscience components. And in the comp neuro class, the neuroscience components are forward, but in the deep learning class, the coding and the way that the networks work mathematically and functionally is more forward. But the neuroscience is there. It's often a bonus lecture that you can watch and.
Okay.
Yeah. So hello, Samantha.
Hey, Sam.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, hi, how is everybody?
Good.
Whatever you were showing when I popped in, Brian, looked really cool. I was listening to the end. Sounds really good. So is that all you're all in neuro match from what I was gathering from the end? Sounded really cool. So I'll give an update, I guess, for this week. I told Jesse and Bradley I had a lot of personal stuff going on from last weekend, but I'm starting to get back into my stuff. I just finished that robotics summer work I was doing the last couple weeks, doing a lot of hands-on, like teaching younger kids how to use different parts of their brain to solve problems. So we started small with like hands-on like challenge cards, this building, and then we worked with a little bit of robot driving and coding towards the end, and they loved it, so it was good. That's been my last week working, but other than that, I've started reading a little bit more on the artificial intelligence empathy stuff, and that's pretty much my update for the week. It's been one of those weeks, but yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, we're going to something, Bradley? Sorry.
Oh, yeah. Well, it sounds great. Thank you for the update. And it sounds like that was pretty fun, the robotics program. And that's always good to have like a lot of outreach and education. And that's part of what we do in the lab. But, doing that, like teaching things to people is always really fun. I think to get like the stuff that and like imparting it to people in different ways, it's always really fun. At least I found it to be fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite parts of my summer is doing especially because they're so little and they look at things in a different way. It's a different perspective on what we do now. So.
Yeah. So I had an idea, and this is on the spot. I thought of two things. One, I thought, and this is up to you. You could write a post about it if you wanted to, or actually thought it might be fun if like we do a post together where almost like I'm interviewing you, but like it's like a really, really simple, like it wouldn't be very long, but it sounded like a really cool experience, and it sounded like very in line with what we're doing about outreach and robotics, and totally what you said about, even the kids who are very young and don't know anything, like just that experience is great. So I feel like it might be, you could, I don't want to, if you want to write it yourself, you could totally do that. But I thought it might be cool also have like kind of like let's interview one of our interns, Sam, about a really cool summer experience that she had. So that might be a fun way to do it.
That'd be cool. We can interview about it. I just want to, I don't have to like mention, because it's like through a school. So I don't want to like make any like, I'm not going to mention names or make any parents.
Oh, absolutely. No. It would be very like, and you don't need to mention, you can be super anonymous. You don't say, you don't have to mention the school itself at all. It could just be like, I had a summer experience where I was teaching children whatever and talk about it that way. So it's up to you. But just came to my mind. It's all very optional, but just came to my mind as something cool to like write about. So yeah.
That's cool. We could do that.
Okay. Cool.
Okay. Well, thanks for the updates. We're very good. So let's see. So I'm going to get into I'm going to go over. Last week I went over NeuroMatch, the computational neuroscience course, the first week, and I just talked about the modeling part. They had a machine learning part, which was just kind of an overview of machine learning, and I might go through that for like a couple minutes, but then I want to get into the dynamical systems stuff and see what they have, and I don't know if we want to discuss it or what, but I just wanted to keep kind of this, deep pod instead of slow pod theme. So let me share my screen here. All right. So the NeuroMatch has it's Comp NeuroMatch. There's also Deep Learning NeuroMatch, which Brian is in, and this is the logo for the NeuroMatch Academy now. So this is CN, and so this is they have every bit of the curriculum up in this sort of format where you can go and you can look at the tutorials. So The general schedule is here, week 1, week 2, week 3. So we talked about the models last week. Then there's generalized linear models, dimensionality, reduction, deep learning. So these are just kind of like overviews of that. So I guess the difference here between computational neuroscience and deep learning is you're getting a lot more neuroscience related things in computational neuroscience. So you're getting a lot of the Bayesian models and control models and reinforcement learning. You're kind of getting it at the end with network causality, that sort of stuff. So it's not just like the deep learning basics and maybe some allied things. They're trying to fit it into this field of computational neuroscience, which is actually much older than deep learning. In computational neuroscience, we mean modeling neurons in the brain, modeling the brain, describing it computationally. So this is again the refreshers. They have refreshers if you need Python refreshers, calculus, statistics. So if we go through a slow pod on this, we might want to unpack some of these refreshers. We might want to go into the modeling stuff and kind of go through that. Then the machine learning stuff, this is all kind of at the review level. So you have model fitting, which of course is where you're working with models. You're trying to fit data to models. I think I talked about that last week, where you're trying to fit the model output to some data in the world, and you're trying to make it as close as possible. And so there are different techniques for this. There are different regression techniques, for example. And MLE and MSE this is maximum likelihood estimate. So there are techniques for that. They kind of go through this in model fitting. So there's a set of tutorial slides. And so the way they do it in NeuroMatch is they get people from the community who can give lectures on this. So Anki Wu gave this lecture. Oops. And she's doing her, I think, graduate or postdoc work. Or no, I guess she's faculty. I don't really know, but they're going to go through this, and then we also have Pierre Etienne, who's also doing this tutorial. And so actually there's a whole team of people who kind of collaborated to put this together. So, there are a lot of things like bootstrapping, multiple linear regression, the bias variance trade-off, and cross-validation. These are all things you need to know for the basic framework of machine learning. Because what you're doing is you're building a model, you're training it with data, and then you want to basically use that model to generalize about the world. So you take some data, which is a limited view of the world, you're putting it into a model, you're training it. The model is making inferences. It gives you output, and it's supposed to be able to describe the world as it is. And of course, we know a lot of the problems with that. I think we've talked about that. But at the heart of it, and sometimes people will be disparaging about machine learning and say, it's all linear regression. It's just linear regression. Don't call it machine learning. But that's not really true. There's more to it than that. But at its heart, what was that? What was that someone said? Oh. I think Brian's trying to say something, but he's echoing. Oh, okay.
It might have been a noise here. I'm sorry if it was.
Oh, okay. So yeah, so basically there is this aspect of linear regression where you're trying to fit things to a regression function. So that's what that's about. But then there are all these different ways you can deal with data. So you do bootstrapping, which is resampling data. Multiple linear regression. So sometimes your data aren't linear. Sometimes you want to describe it with a polynomial. And there are problems with using too high order polynomials, because you can use your line, you can fit it to any data if you use a high enough polynomial to describe it. But sometimes if you use like second or third order polynomials, it's very useful for data that aren't exactly linear. So there are different techniques you can use that get around some of the, sometimes your data doesn't have a linear relationship. Sometimes it's nonlinear. And so, there are things you can use with multiple linear regression or other methods that are similar to just, to sort of get around some of these aspects of the input data. There are things like underfitting and overfitting models. So underfitting is sort of under-describing the actual data with your model. So it would just be like if you just assume that there's a linear relationship between two variables, and it turns out that it's not a linear relationship, that would be underfitting. And then overfitting is having too many parameters that describe the data. So, in deep learning, we use, many, many parameters to describe the models, but that's because the world is complex and we don't want to over-describe the world with our model, but we also don't want to under-describe the world, or at least not account for all the complexity of the world with our model. So there's this bias variance trade-off that becomes important in dealing with these models that is still, really kind of almost data set dependent, but it's also very hard to get a handle on. And people study this, they talk about it a lot. If you see some people talking about machine learning, sometimes we'll have this conversation in the group and we'll say, I didn't want to overfit my model, or I didn't want to underfit my model. So just so we're all on the same page about that, they're talking about sort of the model or the number of parameters they're using to describe the data that they're dealing with. And so I've had this sort of question, and I don't know if I don't think it's a huge question in the literature, but when you have like a large language model or a deep learning model and you have a lot of parameters, do people really kind of consider that to be sort of a form of overfitting? Or I think they have ways around that, but I don't know what the state of the literature is in terms of like thinking about overfitting in some of these models where you have billions of parameters. Certainly if you're dealing with the kinds of systems they're dealing with, you need to have a lot of parameters, but there is this issue of underfitting and overfitting. So a good way to think about this is if you think about like specifying every little thing in your life, right? And you specify everything in your life and you think that you've got your life under control, and then you have a bad day where things go wrong, and none of the things you do to try to control your life work. And so this is kind of the problem with having a lot of different knobs to turn to optimize them, is that you kind of make the model sort of brittle, so that you really don't have any room for sort of natural variation. So there are a lot of things that go beyond this underfitting and overfitting. And then there's cross-validation. So these are ways that you can test for, you can validate the data set. And these are techniques that make sure that you're not making false positives or things like that. And so they kind of walk through these statistical methods. They kind of go over a linear regression, mean squared error, which are different versions of this. They just describe this function and how to sort of optimize your model for some of these functions. And so then they give you a notebook. They go through maximum likelihood estimation, which is always fun. It's really about modeling sort of the greatest likelihood of if you have a data set, what's the likelihood of the distribution? What is it? So we can talk about Gaussian normal distributions. Data can be distributed, spread out in different ways. But there are many cases where the data tends to be around a central value with no bias to left or right. So it's like a Gaussian distribution. Then we really if we generate x from y using this function, which is all the data on the line without noise, we actually don't, we care about that function, but we also care about some of the, we want to know kind of what's along this line. So some of these data points along this line are just, they're actual variation that we care about, but some of it we don't care about, which is measurement noise. So we actually don't care about the deviation from the mean firing rate so much. We care about the trend that goes through that cloud. All right, so this is the principle behind linear regression, but also maximum likelihood estimation, that you're trying to find a line through this point cloud. And you don't really want to just characterize any point cloud with a line. You want to have it trend in some way. So you want to have a goodness of fit to this line. So these data points, if they were just in a circular cloud, we could put a line through it and say, this line fits these data, have a good day, But then it doesn't really fit it because we've just drawn a line through the cloud. And if we actually use some sort of criterion to say, what is the goodness of fit, or how tightly around that line do these data points fit, it would be very low. And so we would have no confidence that that describes the data. This line describes this data pretty well because the blue lines are around this red line. Okay. But we don't care about this variation so much, why exactly it's deviating. And some of this is measurement noise, some of this is actual variation. But we want to describe this line. So this is a maximum likelihood estimation. It's just a way to sort of find this line by using statistical inference. And so they kind of go through some of the mathematics of it. What is the most likely function that you can fit through this point cloud, or this cloud of points? And so this is goes through MLE. It kind of goes through some of the theory. And their packages you can do all this in. So, when they show you the math, they kind of describe the math and they tell you how it works. And then you can find like a package in Python to implement it. And, the point of learning a lot of the math is so that you can understand what happens when you do a certain step. So you implement a line of code, you know what it does. Or if something goes wrong, you know how to fix it. Or sometimes there are assumptions that are made about data that, maybe a data set isn't very good for this particular technique. You want to know if your input data is good for this technique or not. So if I have, that circular cloud of points, I may not want to use MLE. I may want to use another estimation technique, like some radial type of estimation technique, or something else that would fit it. So then they talk about bootstrapping and some of these other techniques, multiple linear regression, which is just multiple variables and so forth. So I'm going to move on to the dynamical systems. And we got someone joining us here. Morgan, hello.
Morning.
Morning.
We're just getting in.
Oh, yeah. So we're going through NeuroMatch, computational neuroscience.
Awesome.
And I'm just kind of going through some of these things. Just a heads up. I'm trying to give a nice little overview. And with the caveat that this, I'm not an expert in any of these areas, but I'm just trying to go through some of them. So this is the Linear Systems Intro to Dynamical Systems. So a lot of people in the lab have been interested in dynamical systems. And it's a really fascinating area because unlike the regression lines that we just talked about, dynamical systems describe the dynamics of a system. So that is, when you have a dynamical system, you have a system that produces things. It's sort of generative in time. So it's producing things in time. It's producing the next data point, or it's describing the data as they flow in time. So like a regression line, a typical linear regression describes what they call independently distributed data, which is or identically independently distributed data, IID, which means that you can describe it with a Gaussian curve. They don't sort of precede one another. And it's like if I sample one, there's no assumption that another point is going to be related to it in any way. They're kind of independent observations. In a dynamical system, you're observing points that are ordered in time somehow. So if I observe one point in my dynamical system, the next point might be, it may be inheriting things from the original point, or it might be constrained by the original point, or whatever. So it's very dependent in terms of time. And so that requires a whole class of models that are different from your typical Gaussian distribution or your typical regression model. And so that's why we talk about dynamical systems. So Eric Shea Brown is the person doing this tutorial. And the slides are here. This is linear dynamical systems. So, you might want to use dynamical systems to describe the brain, or, some other part of biology. It's often been used in biology to describe different processes, because biology is actually about processes. It's not necessarily about static things. We can measure a static brain, for example. We can look at the neuroanatomy. But really, if we really want to understand biology, how it unfolds, like how development unfolds, or how evolution works, or how our hearts pump blood, or how our brains generate a percept, we need to know about the dynamics, and that's very important. So we have so the dynamical systems, you have to describe this in terms of geometry. You have an initial condition, and then you have this trajectory. And I know Jesse likes to talk about trajectory. So, you have this initial condition, you have this trajectory from time point 0 to time point t, and you can describe this function anywhere along the line. You can sample it in a discrete manner or a continuous manner. So if it's a discrete dynamical system, you have these points, and you can describe it by some set that's from time 0 to time t. You can take different points, you can find the difference between them, and it should tell you something about that system. If it's continuous, you would use calculus to find the integrate this region within between time 0 and time t, and then you can describe this trajectory. So that's one advantage of dynamical systems. You can get a history of a system, and it's usually embedded in a geometric space. So this is I think at least this is an n-dimensional space that's shown here. But it's, we can think of it as a 3-dimensional space. It's a phase space. So it's actually probably some sort of dimensionality reduction, where you're taking a bunch of dimensions and boiling it down to 3 to visualize it and describe it. But this trajectory is cutting through the space. And the idea is that you want to take your initial condition, and the initial condition really sets the tenor for this trajectory. So if you start at a certain point, you can go in a certain number of directions. If I start from a different point, it's going to affect my outcome, because I'm going to start from a different position. I'm going to be subject maybe to different constraints, maybe to the same constraints, but I'm in a different portion of this phase space. So the trajectory is going to look a bit different. And so that's the idea, is that it isn't, kind of like something that's independently distributed. A dynamical system is sort of, stochastic. It has this property where you can't really describe its evolution in advance. You can't it's not a deterministic thing. Sometimes you have deterministic dynamical systems. Like if you think about a pendulum, like a physical pendulum, that is a deterministic dynamical system. You can actually describe that pretty easily. But of course, there are fluctuations in the pendulum, so the description isn't absolute. So it's somewhat deterministic. You can basically predict the trajectory, but it has some variation in it. Now, something else, there are other types of dynamical systems which are stochastic and which have a lot of high rate of variability. So this trajectory in those kind of systems will be very different every time you run the system. So I'm thinking now of the brain. Maybe some of the things the brain does are not deterministic. So, maybe something like behavior, sensory motor behavior might be deterministic. Maybe if you learn it, if you train on it and learn something, it's deterministic. But before you train and learn on it, it's not deterministic. And so you could have a wide range of outcomes for something like that. There's some other systems that are pretty much not deterministic. And so there are things that are chaotic or on the edge of chaos that behave like that. And when I say chaos, I mean there's a actual physical description of chaos. I'm not talking about just like chaos. I guess the whole point is that it describes a process that's disordered, but there's a physics definition of it as well. So that's a little bit about dynamical systems, and this is a very small. The slides are pretty small here, but I'm just kind of going through this. You also want to be able to update your dynamical system. So there are all these different rules that you can use to update your system. So you basically have this mathematical structure like this, where you have a differential equation. Sometimes people use evolution equations, which are where you deal with a discrete system where there's a change over time, and you want to account for that change in the next time step. Sometimes you have dynamical systems where, like this is an ODE. There are different versions of a dynamical equation. There's ODE, which is ordinary differential equation. There's SDE, which is stochastic differential equation. There's a PD, which is a partial. And these differential equations allow you to describe like a continuous system with some sort of function. So this function is basically this trajectory. And it's integrating x over t. So it's integrating x over time. And you're describing this trajectory. And so you may be able to do this completely, or you may only be able to do it in parts because you don't know the entire, everything about the system. You don't know what's affecting the system. You don't know the whole system, like what's generating the behavior. So with the brain, you often have like this situation where the brain is doing something and you can describe the output measure, but you can't describe what's going on inside as well as you would like. So that's always something to think about with these kind of systems. So they get into Hodgkin-Huxley, which is this model of generating spikes in the brain, and they kind of go through this part of the tutorial where they set this up as some dynamics. You can describe it with an ODE. You can give, it can tell you something about spike generation over time. And the Hodgkin-Huxley model is just a way to specify the different the parameters of the biophysics of the neurons. So this is one example. But now you can actually use different types of systems where you can look at a bunch of different cells and a bunch of different cell types simultaneously. So this is where now we can bring computing resources to bear. We can set up a bunch of differential equations simultaneously and run them and get a result, simulate them and get results. This is something that they've done in physics for a while, and they're doing it in neuroscience where they have these coupled dynamical equations that run, on a supercomputer, and they run them for days, and then they can actually say things about the brain. Because, Hodgkin-Huxley will work maybe if you're interested in a single neuron, or maybe a small group of neurons, or homogeneity within neurons, and different types of ion channels and things like that. But this gives you a lot more flexibility to describe different types of neurons. So this is the linear dynamical systems. This is math. You see the math scrawled out. But in a linear dynamical system, you're putting together where you go is the sum of your parts. So we've talked about emergent systems where it's sort of more than the sum of its parts. In this case, you're just interested in the sum of the parts, and you're modeling that. So, and then this is an example of timescales in neural networks, how the brain keeps the eyes still. So this is an example of something that you can describe using dynamical equations or dynamical systems. You can describe this process of motor control of the eyes. Then there are, different types of models, accumulator models. This is for looking at the time course of perceptual choice. So again, you can describe behavior as this time course as opposed to like independent experimental observations. You can describe it as a temporal process that goes on. And, there are different dynamics within that time course. So you can observe things you wouldn't be able to observe just by considering an experiment as a trial-by-trial endeavor. So, yeah, I think that's enough on that. Then they talked about Markov processes, which are, I think we've talked about this in the open source group, ironically enough. But we've talked about these Markovian models, which are where you have these discrete states, and there are these transition values between the states that have some probability. So these are, I guess they're dynamical systems, but they're, they give you a model for describing change over time. So you can set up your model as a set of discrete states. You can set up the transition probabilities, and then you can run the Markov model and observe these changes. Markovian models are nominally sort of, they can be random, or they can have different probabilities that are weighted. So as much as, you can set up as little or as much as you know about the system. So if you know a lot about the system, you can, specify the model quite a bit. If you don't, then you can specify it maybe as a set of nondescript states with random probabilities. It doesn't necessarily help you very much, but and then history dependence, which is also very important in linear models, dynamical systems models, means that, when you have a point in time, and I said before that it's dependent, the points are dependent in time, where you've been previously will determine where you go. So your history will guide you to a set of outcomes that you wouldn't otherwise have. If your history is different, you would have a different set of outcomes that are possible. So history dependence is very important in a lot of these systems. And so this is part of this trajectory thinking. When you have a certain history, you end up with a certain trajectory. And so it's a very different way of thinking from a standard IID statistical model. So they kind of go through linear dynamical systems here, and they talk about state variables. And these state variables, which is this x of f, or f of x, that will describe your states in a Markov model. So they kind of go through the difference between linear and not linear. So they go through deterministic dynamical systems. This particular tutorial, it's Bing-Wen Brunton. So she's done a lot of good stuff in neuroscience and behavior and dynamical systems. So this is a pretty good tutorial, kind of going through some of these models. So this is a model of, this is actually it's not the predator-prey model, but it's the lynx and hare model, which it describes two species where you have, well, actually, in this case, this is just growth of rabbits in Australia, where rabbits have grown exponentially in Australia. And that's a good way to describe it, is by using this very simple one-dimensional deterministic linear system. There are other models like the predator-prey model, which would involve having a predator regulate the population of rabbits so that as the predator population grew, the number of rabbits would decrease, which would decrease the number of predators, which would then increase the number of rabbits. And so if you add in the predator to this model, you can change this from a 1D deterministic linear system to a sort of a coevolutionary system with 2 dimensions. So it's kind of interesting how you can build upon these models. But this gives a lot of practical examples of things. In this exercise, you would simulate one of these very simple dynamical systems and then explore how the behavior is determined by parameter A. So this kind of walks you through this model, and then you do the tutorial, and I think the notebooks, the notebooks are down in this part of the tutorial page. So, okay, then they get into the lynx and the hare model, which is an addition to the original model and describes a more complex system. So that is Markov processes. Then the third tutorial is combining determinism and stochasticity. So as I talked about stochasticity, that's where you have a system that is governed by sort of random processes, or that random processes are generated from the system. So stochastic means just, it's random, but it's not. Randomness is something you find in a system. Stochasticity is the thing that generates random outcomes. So, you can have something that generates deterministic outcomes. So, for example, we know that, like, if you had a coin with both sides being heads, that if you flip the coin, it will always be heads. That's a deterministic outcome. If you have a coin that has a heads and a tails, and you flip it, then that flip is a stochastic generating process, meaning I flip the coin and I don't know what the state will be. I know what the average will be, that it should be, half of the times I flip it should be heads, half of the times I flip it should be tails. But for any one outcome, I can't be sure what that outcome will be. It's always probabilistic. And so that's the difference between determinism and stochasticity. Determinism is where you have this, it always comes out a certain way, or it always comes out a certain number of ways. And stochasticity means that this outcome is always contingent upon some sort of probability. So they talk about how to combine these two ways of thinking in some, dynamical systems type techniques. And so they get into random walks, which are nice, and then Ornstein-Uhlenbeck processes, which I'm not really familiar with. But in any case, they go through the tutorial slides for this. And this is more just kind of like practice here. There isn't a lot more about theory that we need to go over there. Then there are autoregressive models, which are where you do a regression on a single series. So you're looking at these Markovian models where you're trying to figure out what the next state will be, or how the states over time are correlated. So sometimes people will do temporal autocorrelations, where they look at a sequence in time, and they try to find correlations over time. And so the idea is you want to find out where the correlations are over time, and it tells you something about that process. There are also spatial autocorrelations, which are correlations in space. And these are, techniques you can use to find patterns in a spatial array or in a temporal sequence. And, they use autocorrelation because it correlates against itself as opposed to correlating against some other variable. And so this kind of goes into how this can be applied to the brain, and then kind of gets into some diagrams of showing how you can work with electric physiological data to, how this is useful in electrophysiological data. And everything in computational neuroscience is oriented towards the brain. So finally, there are these suggested further readings. We have all these papers that you can go into if you're interested in these topics. Just basic neuroscience references. So if you're interested in these kind of systems, more generally, you might want to find books on them or other papers on other fields. But this is the neuroscience-oriented reading list. And there's a lot of stuff in here. It's good stuff. People do a lot of interesting things with dynamical systems in neuroscience. But yeah, I think it's definitely worth checking out more if you're interested.
That's incredible content.
Yeah. So I just scratched the surface. I call it a deep pod, but I'm just kind of considering what's there,
Yeah. I wanted to just make a comment about something you'd said at the beginning about, when I joined, not the beginning, but about the role of dimensionality reduction in dynamical systems kind of estimation. And do you remember this paper? I think you posted this Twitter list of papers from, it was like 11 papers. I forget who it was from.
Yeah.
But there was the last paper was toroidal topology of population activity in grid cells.
Oh, okay.
And where they're looking for this connected continuous attractor networks.
Yeah.
And it's, if you look in figure 4, analysis of principal components and number of cells and number of toroidal peaks. I'll try. I'll put the link into
Okay.
Into Slack. Not sure which channel I'll put it in. Neuroscience networks.
Okay.
Just something that comes up a lot, which is choosing the number of components.
Oh yeah.
and how, you know, I mean, this is an amazing paper, and I think that she put this on the list as a demonstration of, like, I forget what her tag was, but it was something like, this is where neuroscience is today, or something like that. Or this is the really interesting thing about, you know, mathematics and neuroscience coming together. And you know, again, it's like, it's an awesome paper. But it really seems like, if you look at figure 4, like, the PCA cutoff is totally arbitrary.
Yeah.
I mean, they you know, they eyeball it.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
There's no, they're like, hey, if we take it out this far, you know, we get these nice patterns. And I'm like, but wait, is that like 95% of the variance?
Yeah.
Is that 99? like, did you, you know, because it looks like it's like 70%.
Right.
You know, like, you know, and you know, and it comes up in a number of places. You know, previously, this is you know, I've seen this in some of the Phil's papers on dynamic causal modeling, where, you know, they're going to do dynamic causal modeling, but in, you know, there's a very small paragraph in pre-processing where it's just like, we did PCA and we retained the first 3 components, and they don't even say like did that explain a lot of the variance?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Or is, you know, and it has a, you know, it has a dramatic effect, right? And it's one of those things where, you know, essentially any of the kind of cutoffs, or, you know, principled dimensionality reduction is you know, is super hard. And it's just going through Francois Chalet's deep learning book, and, you know, and it's funny because in his discussion of pre-processing, he's like, you know, he's like, pre-processing can be real, you know, a big part of your work of you know, getting the appropriate tensors.
Right. Yeah.
and I think it's, you know, good to respect that. I mean, I don't know how much Neuromatch is, you know, focused in on that, but
yeah, I think
a big
it is
problem, but also super important, right? I mean, like, you can also utilize it in really interesting ways in terms of multi-way methods and tensor networks and things. Yeah, terrific paper that I want to say it was, like, for some reason I want to say last name was Rust. Does that sound right?
Oh, maybe, yeah. It could have been.
Like,
yeah.
It was like 10 or 11 papers.
Okay. I think I remember what you're talking about. Yeah. So this is this is always an issue, like, with these methods in general, is that you have to pick the right parameter values, and you have to pick the right cutoffs, and then you have to justify why you did it. And, like, a lot of groups, I think, will I think people wouldn't use the technique. There's that tendency to say, well, this works well. You just kind of explore, you do like a parameter sweep, and you say, this works well. That's it. I've seen, like, papers like that where they say, well, this is the best result, this is the best fit we find. And it's like, well, that's great, but, like, what, like, does that tell us anything? Like,
you know, this is, I'm just drawing from a fMRI example, but, you know, like, Christian Beckman's ICA work, right? Like, a big part of that work was just coming up with the kind of the automated component identification.
Yeah.
Right. And he's certainly not saying that this is getting like the right one. What he's saying is by mixing AIC, BIC, and a probabilistic PCA, he's just like, this gets me to the optimal number for fMRI studies, or something. There's almost some legalese in terms of how he's describing.
Yeah.
Don't think that this is getting the exact right.
Yeah.
I also dropped in a link to the Pirates project from Leipzig. You were mentioning the Hodgkin-Huxley.
Hodgkin-Huxley.
Hodgkin-Huxley. But Wilson Cohen and Kuramoto oscillators and all of those. I also dropped a link in the network neuroscience.
Yeah.
It's a great project that gives you examples of all those different kind of cortical architectures, or as you're saying, these are all simplifications of network models.
Yeah.
Network neuroscience models. But Pirates is a great way to look across those models, or certainly to give you a sense of the different models.
Yeah, this is great. So let me share my screen. I have it up. We can take a look at it.
Yeah, if you just scroll down like halfway, I think is the...
Yeah, so the model introductions, actually.
Yeah.
So, these are different models for, like, modeling. So this Pirates is, like, it's looking at, like, I wouldn't say neural coding, but it's kind of like the electrical activity in the brain. And it's just kind of using a model to interpret them. So everything you do when you have data is you want to pick a model to interpret the data. So you say, I'm going to pick this model and it has certain features and assumptions, and then I'm going to take my data, I'm going to fit it into this model, and it'll sort of interpret some of the data, so it'll like boil it down to descriptive parameters and things like that. And then, there are these different models that you can use. So there's neural mass, mean field, different type of neural mass. There's an Van der Pol oscillator, Kuramoto oscillator, another mean field model oscillator. So, you have these different things that will give you, like the Kuramoto oscillator is like synchronized oscillators. So it allows you to sort of evaluate when, like, your neurons are basically performing an oscillation, and when neurons are synchronized, you can describe that with the Kuramoto oscillator model. And so it just basically gives you a framework for that, and a nice mathematical description. Whereas if you just looked at the data, you'd have to basically look at it and say, that looks nice, it doesn't look nice. These give you a little bit deeper appreciation for the you can say, like, this is different because this parameter value is different, or there are different ways you can evaluate it. So I like how they have these different models that you can implement.
And just like the dimensionality reduction, the choice of dimensions, and your choice of models interact, and it's one of those things with again with dynamic causal modeling that Phil has an SPM. It only has the chance and RIT. Whereas if you turn the crank on all those models, but replace that with with one of these, or with a modified chance and RIT, that obviously there could be a change and perhaps a better fit, right?
Yeah.
That we just don't look typically.
Yeah.
Fitting one model is pretty hard. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And then you can analyze your models using these different like parameter sweeps, differential evolution, analysis of delayed differential equations, and so forth. So there are different ways you can analyze your model. And if it depends, again, there is a lot of assumption that goes into model building, and I think it's really underappreciated. I mean, it's not underappreciated, but I think it's just so paramount that like we can't ignore, we can't just say it's a minor thing because, and again, even interpreting your model, saying what looks good. Okay, what does that mean? I don't know. It just looks good. I want it. I want to keep it. It's very important, you know.
It's difficult when you want a narrative for your paper, right? Or you want a narrative for yourself,
Yeah.
and so it's tough to look across all models and then see all these different results and it becomes much harder to say which one's the kind of the best fit or which one's the best fit because of your pre-processing.
Right. Yeah. So there are a lot of we also have like methods for competing models. So if you're using like 5 different models on your data set and you want to say which one is best, there are these different techniques that people use for model selection. So that's another area that's important, and I won't go into that today, but it's basically a way to sort of like there's information criterion that you can use or other types of model selection techniques. And those are statistical methods that tell you how good of a fit your model is compared to other models. And so that's another way to do that. But again, it's like I want to have some criterion to know if what I'm saying or what I'm basing my assumption on in the paper or wherever I'm reporting it is, there's a basis for it in reality. That I'm not just we're disconnected enough from reality modeling as it is, I think, a lot of times. Yeah. So, did anyone else have any comments on that? Thoughts about?
I mean, it's fascinating stuff, and we've been running into this problem with our project in NeuroMatch where we're trying to get the data to look right.
Yeah.
Like it's really noisy right now, and so we know that there's something about the way that we're modeling. We just need to. It's like, but what if what if the data is just noisy and that's just the way it is? I mean, so I love hearing about these questions in more detail and related to the specific mathematics, like especially principal component analysis and dimensionality reduction is such a fascinating topic and something that's been coming up a lot in deep learning and the deep learning neuromatch as a way to talk about generalization. Like if you can collapse the dimensionality of the math of the net, then it can generalize better. It's not necessarily true, so there's all these kind of, it's so exciting as like a field that is just still in its infancy, I feel like.
Yeah.
So it's great to think about that.
Yeah. I think it's worth mentioning that a lot of these really sophisticated techniques have come about with the advent of computers that can really do high-end computations, and so that's not been that long with respect to like you have like I don't know, maybe 60 good years of that, and then we have to kind of come up with methods that we can use. So we're not even really thinking about these things until we can like put them into a computer and because otherwise they're just kind of like hypothetical mathematical things. When you start working with data, it's a little bit different. You can get like really some good results and see how they actually work. Like, I mean, dimensionality reduction is something that is not that old compared to like physics, but actually working on with real data sets and seeing the limits of the techniques, that's where it's there's a lot to say about that. And yeah,
just make a pitch for multi-way methods again in terms of really expanding PCA's ability to capture the dynamics, and that how this is kind of the other side of compressibility, and certainly this the multi-way paper that was the basis of my first poster back at CNS like 2001. Was talked a lot about the generalizability and compressibility relationship and this trilinear modeling. So it was a really simple extension of PCA to multi-channel, multi-subject, and I'll find that link too.
All right. In the interest of time, I want to move on to what Jesse was going to talk about. Jesse wanted to talk about some career development stuff. So do you want to take it away?
Oh, yeah. No, I really like the discussion we just had also. I feel like I have a lot of thoughts about it. And I hope we continue to there's a lot of really, a lot of the stuff that we're doing in the lab right now is super like theory based, but getting to work with data and test stuff out is something I kind of look forward to focusing more on in the future. But yeah, as far as we pull this thing up here, let's see.
I just wanted to post this really quick because the discussion before about how we've recently got computers that can actually do this kind of deep analysis reminded me of Vannevar Bush's differential analyzer, this giant room filled with electromechanical devices for calculating differential equations. I love that stuff.
Yes, sir. And I actually, as a trajectory fiend, which is a weird term that I just used for the first time ever. Yeah, I think it's interesting to see. I would love to have like a timeline about that specifically. Anyway, yeah, I'm gonna jump into that thing, and then actually before. So I may not be able to stay for the whole time. I might have to leave a little bit earlier.
Okay.
If you don't mind, I might show my extremely crude diagrams of my outline posters first, because it's just going to be, hey, here's look at this stuff, and no discussion about it. And then I might jump into this thing and just like have a little more discussion about that, and I might go. Is that okay, Bradley?
Yeah, that'd be good.
Okay. Just to show, very unflatteringly where we are with some of the posters, but like this will be my weekend project in a lot of ways to put the things together. Am I sharing my screen?
I can't see it.
Oh, geez. I guess I can't show my screen, so I don't have any updates to show. No. Here, this should work. Let's just show the exact screen. Yeah.
There we go.
All right. So here you go. These are not fleshed out at all, but I'm thinking about. I was originally considering a design like this, where you have title, whatever, and then theory, diagrams, and technology, methodology, and tech and law. But I think this might be a better layout, putting it like here. And I'm really thinking a lot about both the diagrams for the embodiment levels. I wish I could quickly draw them out. And then also sort of like when I keep talking about the landmark stuff, I feel like I could create a diagram. I think that will be really cool, because I might ask one of my designer friends to help me with it a little bit. And Avery's actually an artist, so maybe they could help with it. But I think being able to kind of talk about the landmark stuff that we've talked about in the reading group will be really good, and combining that with some theory talk and maybe a little bit of Varela here. And I don't know, I'm not sure if Alicea kind of really works, but we have stuff with that. I have a lot of technology things to draw from, even including like. Thanks again to Morgan for like the cognition with the X people. I've actually showed a little bit of that to one of the other groups that I'm working with, and they're intrigued, and I've been in contact with them a little bit, so we'll see where that goes. But yeah, this is just putting things on a very simple map for now, or fake poster for now. But over the course of this weekend, I think I'm gonna maybe not here, but I'm gonna write out a few more things. And if folks want to contribute or feedback, or even particularly like just, I might mention it also at the reading group meeting, just because people, for those who've been involved in that discussion, I think I'd be curious to kind of see what they might want to highlight in the context of these posters, and I'll go over the posters more then too. And then really quickly for the second one, I think this one's actually, I changed it from, I think, robot companions to digital companionship. I think that's actually a really good title for what we're looking at. This is the more humanities-based one where I'm going to kind of go into plot twisters, but a little bit of time spent on the social ills and maybe some statistics or graphics about all of those things. Go over certain related technologies, and then the methodologies part will be interesting because I don't know if I really want to. This may be a bit more allostatic kinds and some of like what I'm actually going to change this. Some of what we're talking about in plot twisters is called, like, a kind of term that Jenny's using. It's called journey building, and I think these might be. I might mention these specifically as quote unquote methodologies or techniques, and these, like, plot twisters would be kind of an example of that, and another group that's related. So it's sort of like creating the background, creating some of the technology that's facilitating it in a not so highlighted sense, but looking at how some of our, like, real life examples of communities doing it, or like groups that are doing things, and some of the specifics they're looking at and how they're doing it. And the rel is kind of a question mark because that's none of these people are quoting Varela on becoming aware or embodied mind and saying, oh, how are we going to, it's not quite like that, but I may weave it in there a bit if it fits. I'm thinking it won't, honestly, right now, because there's a lot here. So this is it right now. There's not really even, I would say, oh, if you have any questions, ask me, but it might not really be the most productive way to do it right now. I think it'll be me fleshing out a bit more, and then I'll put it in WeRobot channel and then probably link it to general and say, hey, at this point, let's go from there. So I'll leave it at that for the time being. But I may ask Bradley to share the Slack channel because I don't think I can share Slack right now.
Okay, well, let me share my screen. So which channel do you want to bring up?
General. It's the one from...
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to shift back to the main...
Okay, so this is right here. This statement here by Jesse. So go ahead.
Yeah, so the point of discussion... I'm trying to be concise because I don't have that much time. I had a really interesting experience this week, and I think I've had similar. I think it's my first time having it in a really robust sense on the private sector side, and the context is I'll continue to use the phrase, in another group that I'm working with. One of my roles, among several, is scouting some new technology, but also scouting what other groups or people producing technology or software, I suppose, are doing. And I was assigned a specific task to evaluate and kind of see where a certain group was at. And it was a really interesting situation because in in academia and in some places, like there's such a range of like theory versus concrete reality and what's acceptable in different fields of study, or not even fields of study, but like in private sector, or in getting a startup and trying to be the first to produce a technology. There's a sense of what you can deliver, and can you physically do it? Can you make it happen? Can you do what you're describing to do? And there's different pressures and timelines about what those are. And I think I know Morgan and Bradley can probably speak about it better than I can, so I'm opening it up to comments from you all. But it was really interesting for me as someone who's more early career. I've kind of been exposed to it on, like in some of my other previous lab work and stuff, there was, my first ever PI was really focused on, I wanted to push this specific project forward. I want to build out this sort of annotated data set that will really help with this certain cause about, interpreting human dynamics or relationships in a certain way. And there was a very particular pressure that was not like producing a data set or producing a data set is one thing, producing a methodological lens is another. And then being, doing things in like different areas of nonprofits that were more or less targeted towards certain concrete objectives or not. And then some things even here in the lab, like we will have these deadlines, or like Google Summer of Code is kind of an interesting example, because the goal of Google Summer of Code is to have a workable piece of code, but it's not necessarily maintain this project for a long time. It in many ways they aren't. They're just like, here's a couple months and then you stop. Some things don't, but and that's kind of an interesting meta situation for our current Google Summer Code project, which is like, are things going to be maintained? Can you maintain them? And what's the ethics around that and so on, which is really, that's cool. But I think the last week or so for me has been, one of the executives in the group, we were discussing my scouting report, and one of the executives we were in a group call similar to this, like Gisty, where you can share your screen and all that stuff. And it was funny because they couldn't see, the one person was calling in, they couldn't see the screen, and they were like, yeah, just want to point out there's a big difference between what people can deliver and at what level they can deliver it as a functioning product versus what they want to be able to deliver and where they are in being able to deliver that product at scale or at the amount that they want to do it. And I feel like, I guess I don't have like an amazing point of salience to make outright, but I feel like a certain kind of appreciation for like all along the spectrum of like pure academic theory development to creating something maybe more methodological or more data set or more concrete that other people can use, to a product that's in development in a prototype stage, to we have this product ready, tested, and able to be produced at scale. And I feel like that's just such an amazing range of it's almost similar to like when we talked before about being like full stack scientists and being able to talk about a problem from its theory to its like practical applications and all the steps in between, and like as a scientist or as a researcher, being able to know, okay, well here's the big problem in the field we're addressing, here's kind of the theory what people thought about, here's my implementation, here's what I specifically did in my experiment or results of why, here's my conclusion, here's where I think we should go next. Like all the big, from the big picture down to the microscopic details. It's kind of like a similar spectrum to that, but when it comes to the external world version of it, and what you can talk about it when. I feel like there's a similar expression, and there's definitely, product development life cycles and things like that we can go into with management stuff. Yes. But even from the perspective of somebody looking at what your aims are and what needs to be done and so on, I don't know. I feel I'm just kind of like I have a sense of appreciation about it. I think I didn't finish what I was saying when the executive was in the group call, right? And I was sharing my screen and they couldn't see it, and they kind of interjected by saying, we got to be really. It's important because we're trying to develop this product, and we're working to do. We are prototyping right now. We're working on moving some things forward. We have the partners, we have our plan, and then we have our scaling process and our ability to get real life testing data that we can use to refine our products in the prototyping stage. Like, we are about to do that. And it was this commentary about, it was this really interesting commentary about, they said, we got to, it's important to differentiate when people say they want to do something and then what they can do, and how much that should affect how you're approaching like either the competition or the challenge at hand. And as they couldn't see the screen, but I basically shifted tabs and went to this place in the companies that I scouted their blog, their website page, and I scrolled down to this area and said, oh, this feature, and this one, well, we're still in research about. And it was like, yes, like how you have to be able to talk about stuff, but then even in the more cutthroat world of getting your product out there and getting the technology developed and saying it, like there's the sense of how you can only be so open about it, but then when it's time to say and show, hey, here is our functioning product, you can buy it right now. It's just a different kind of it's different, and I think to try to crystallize this into a takeaway nugget for people here today is it's really interesting and very healthy self-awareness to understand where you are in the spectrum of what you're developing and what time constraints and external pressures are affecting the deadlines to do it. And if you prefer to be in one set of those circumstances, like really knowing, and you the more time you spend like in the private sector or in theory-based research where you've got to get the paper out and write the paper, like the deadlines will affect how you prioritize stuff. And I'll leave it at that. I feel like, I know we don't have much more time left and I have to go soon. But if, Bradley or Morgan or anybody else wants to say things about that, you're welcome. But that was kind of my freestyle stream of consciousness thoughts about stuff from all that the last couple of weeks.
It's very good. Very good. Morgan or Brian or Samantha, did you have anything to say about that? I think Morgan, you're muted. Okay.
Certainly that, science is like software development in that, you're trying to build something that hasn't been built before, Yeah. And it's hard to know. I find it hard to know where I lie on the spectrum of skills needed, skills developed and ready to apply to the problem, and knowing what's the appropriate timeline to lay out for development, Yeah. Again, like when you're tackling an unknown kind of problem, or you're building something that hasn't been built before, right? These are really tough problems.
and it's really like, I think I can't say too much for a variety of reasons, but I just maybe I'll think about it more and try to distill it into some blog post or some other deliverable thing to talk about. But like, it's really fascinating to see people trying very, very, very hard to coordinate internal and external, like internal product development or internal technology development, not even a product, like components. You like people are working on the computer vision part, the networking, the alerting communications part, and get like talking to the hardware providers that you can get, like if you're going to use the NVIDIA product, like getting the NVIDIA product, like that's like a whole challenge of itself, and coordinating that timeline with the engineers or the developers who are doing their stuff, plus partnering with the external people who you need to round things out or like scale it at level. Like that's such a, I've never really been exposed to that at the level I have been recently, and I just feel like it's probably a really amazing thing to understand where whatever you're doing is in that process, even if it's like, I don't know, it's like perspective and oh wow, like this is going on, but yeah, it's tough, and like it's very, particularly when people are really invested in the research. I imagine some other places are more like, we want just get to market with the the minimum viable thing. Yeah, sure. But when people really want to produce a new technology that people haven't done before, it's very, nobody knows the timelines. Nobody really knows if the components you think are going to work the way they want to. And it's sort of like this push to a deadline, but then the more, like, there's a sobriety about, well, nobody on the planet knows if this is going to work, so we're going to hope this works, and then it's probably not going to work, but we're going to, like, the software, the incremental development stuff, then we can go that way. And it's just such a weird, I've never been in a situation where I've seen like the different moving parts from internal to external this way, and it's just like, I'm not at all saying I'm controlling them or I'm some executive person making decisions. I'm just kind of like an observer, and it's like, wow, like the machine is complex, and not like multiple machines. It's not even one. It's just this like herding of cats. That's like, this is how technology is actually made. It's like, oh shit, like I didn't, I don't like, I've never really, like, being exposed to it so directly has been fascinating and exciting and scary, and just, that's all. I'll leave it at that. That's probably all I can say. Yeah.
Have you ever seen that meme? It's like where they have the two sides. They say, this is your PhD proposal, and it's like a sculpture, wonderful sculpture, and then this is your PhD, and it's like some like failed baking project.
Like accurately drawn horse painting, and then like a horse that's like partly drawn nicely, and then just at the end. Yeah, I think about that a lot.
So that's very much in the vein of what you're saying, and that's because you can't, like, you have this plan, but then you have to implement it in a certain amount of time, and there's things you can't just explore, detours you make. So it's always especially with like a PhD project, it's always like what you can kind of get at, as opposed to the plan, which is like, this is if it were to work perfectly and if I had infinite time, but of course you don't. And so I did a talk recently to some other groups on sort of the role of complexity, problem complexity, and complexity theory, and like project management. Now I'll have to send you the slides on that because I didn't share them in our group, but yeah, this is the meme. So yeah, definitely that's what we see. But yeah, I mean, so that's I have some thoughts on that, but I don't have the slides here. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely a problem, just kind of like getting your head around some of these things. And we, especially the project management tools we use, are sort of biased towards like the linear path and like kind of like thinking about things as known units. And so, and I don't know if, like, software development, I can tell you, depending on what you're doing, is knowable or not knowable. Like, if you're trying to develop, like, I've worked with Rockwire, which is a platform for smart campuses, smart campus apps, where you're taking in data from a college campus and you're putting it into a form that people can interact with. It tells you things about different processes on the campus, or and so that's very difficult to get that coordinated and get that to work, and then to have people use it. So I mean, that's actually not necessarily knowable, because you have to think about, like, the problem as a sort of a thing that no one's done before, or some automation that people actually use. And you don't know if people will use it or how they'll find it useful. So it's always like that there are a whole host of things you don't know in software development. Finally, I would say about, like, GSOC, our projects, I agree, and I've had this issue kind of in the back of my head about, like, we do GSOC and we produce these projects and we produce, like, software, but then, usually we don't stress maintenance. And sometimes you can get GSOC funding to maintain some software, but not in the way that you might want to. Like, you can have a project where you build the software and then next year, like, add on to it. But you do need to have that group of maintainers who kind of constantly audit the project, make sure it's working well. If people want to contribute patches or things, to review those and make sure they're up to standards, that's something that's people really don't fund. And so that's a problem too, that, like, that maintenance of the software is always difficult to so you're generating new stuff but not necessarily maintaining it. That's always
there are more there are other kind of software development models that aren't necessarily linear. It's been a while since I've looked at those, but there's definitely some more kind of, like, if you will, spirals.
Oh, right.
Where you're kind of coming around again and again, and again, sorry, it's not really my area. I was software, thrown into software engineering.
Yeah.
And was just trying to make it through. But yeah, it's really tough to know how people will respond to it and its usability. But the sustainability, is the real thing, right? And so Software Sustainability Institute and its work, and there's another research software engineering focused group. I mean, it's like RSE, research software engineering, that talks a lot about these, all these issues. That is a great resource too. If you've gone through their stuff, Jesse.
Probably not recently. I feel like maybe someone that Bradley. I don't know if we talked about them before, but not recently.
Not recently,
no. But yeah, I think I might actually have to leave now, but I might try to listen. Are you going to go over papers and stuff?
Yeah, I'm going to go over a paper that we talked about a couple weeks ago, internal paper, and then maybe a paper after that. But you can catch up on the recording. So
no, and I think I'm going to just listen on my phone. But I'll
yeah, it's fine too.
Keep it, buddy, and I'll be listening. Maybe say a few things.
Oh, okay.
Kind of like I have to go travel a bit, so yeah.
Okay, take care.
Yeah.
Right. So Brian posted a couple things in here. Differential analyzer, which is the Vannevar Bush. And Vannevar Bush was always like some great ideas, like way back around the World War II era, and so they're still influencing us today. So this is like an early version of some of these sort of complexity tools for, kind of computing complexity and getting our hands around it. And then, a little bit later on, there was a lot of stuff done with fractals and with like computing differential equations, so we could create like these complex systems. So, I mean, definitely complex systems and complexity and dynamical systems are really something that are really kind of emerged as we've gotten the computing to calculate them, right? So you can now simulate a bunch of dynamical equations, and what the behaviors are, and it's something that it's kind of an exciting frontier, I guess. Software AC.uk is Software Foundation. Okay, so that's something.
In case anybody wanted to, because I have that website bookmarked, but I don't look at it very often. So thank you so much, Morgan. That's super helpful to be reminded of that. And another reason I keep thinking about Vannevar Bush, and I wanted to just bring it up in the context of what we were talking about, is that I think memristors and a lot of hardware kind of breakthroughs that have been happening in the last few years. I hope that we start to streamline the process of building computers so that instead of focusing so much on making software do everything, that we also start to be able to make hardware that does what we try to do with software. I think that's after the GPU thing that reaches its compute limit. I think that's probably going to be our DIY next step, to start making custom hardware for specific deep learning applications and things.
Yeah.
There was a post, I don't know if you remember seeing this or someone else mentioned it, but I saw a Twitter thing about that. I don't know if I put it on my timeline. It's kind of specifically about that almost explicitly, interestingly enough.
I mean, certainly, FPGAs and now ASICs are things that you can access on the cloud. So even if they're not necessarily neuromorphic, there's great examples currently of people again, like taking particular operations that will be much more efficient or much faster on on configurable hardware like FPGAs, and but the neuromorphic, the kind of like Spinnaker and brain scales and things like that are they're super exciting for the non-standard architectures as well, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for that. So now I'm going to talk about this internal paper. Like a couple weeks ago, we talked about the continual learning stuff and some of the things at the Bradenberg vehicles, and we actually have a paper. It's on the archive, but I need to update it because I want to make it a little bit different than what it is now. I just wanted to go over it internally if people are interested in contributing to it. So I'm making a bunch of different changes here, and I'm making notes in here. We have some other things. So it was like in the context of a set of reviews that were being addressed, which it was a rejection, but it was like a set of reviews. So that's why I'm making changes on it. But basically, it's this continual embodied learning using developmental Bradenberg vehicles. So we have this developmental Bradenberg vehicles paradigm that we've got a paper on. And then now we're kind of mapping that to this continual embodied learning aspect. So this is something that we've developed with a couple people like Rashab and Akshara, who contributed in different ways. So the idea is to sort of take these developmental Bradenberg vehicles and maybe agents more generally into this context of continual embodied learning. So continual learning we talked about as being very broad. In our case, it's more about the dynamical aspect of it and looking at different time scales of their evolution. So as a paper, this is more of kind of a theory-driven paper that introduces some concepts of how you might approach this problem. And I do have a timeline, and I think I've shown it in different meetings, but I don't know if it's in this paper right now. Okay, it is. So there's a timeline that kind of goes over the timelines of cognition and what we might characterize. So this paper kind of goes through some of what's going to be used here, kind of describing the problem. This is a diagram of the development of Bradenberg vehicles as they're sort of assembling their nervous system. And this maybe should go down maybe to figure 2 or figure 3 instead of figure 1, but I'm still thinking about that. Then we talk about spatially dependent embodiment. So this is where you have, is that? Okay. Where you have embodiment in is spatially distinct things. So like, for example, this Brandenburg vehicle, it's developing with sensors, with effectors, with an internal nervous system. The vehicle is sort of defines the shape of the nervous system. You can also go to, it can explore its world where it's interacting with things in different directions. So the sensors might be in different parts of the body. The effectors might be in different parts of the body. And then, that's spatially dependent because you have things like lateralities and you have different places in the nervous system where things might be distributed. So if you had 2 sensors on the side, your sensors on the side versus sensors in the front, it's like, animals that have eyes on the side of their heads versus eyes that face forward, they have a different view of the world. So those are all things that are kind of in this area. Then talk about a little bit about critical periods. So this paper is really just at this point is almost like a sort of a smorgasbord of some of the things we talk about in the group. But, kind of go over critical periods and then kind of get into the methodology. So there's this artificial genetics aspect. So these vehicles have an innate aspect, which is where they develop from like a germ cell or a germ, and then they develop into these vehicles. And so this is a diagram showing this process of developing the body, or you can develop the nervous system from a fixed body. So you can develop both of those things independently. But the idea is that you have this innate starting point, and you can encode these things in something like an artificial genome or some set of environmental parameters, etc. So this is kind of goes over some of this. They're blank spots because these are things that are being added, but they're kind of in development right now. So this is a paper in flux. The reason I'm showing it is just to give an idea of what's in here, so that maybe we can make some connections. Then we talk about connectivity in the development of Brandenburg vehicle. So there's this internal network that we can model as a connection matrix, as we do with networks in the brain or other kinds of networks. It comes down to this connectivity matrix, what's connected to what, and, kind of goes through that. This is kind of a diagram of this, where cells are born, they die, or they're born at different times in development. So these lines show like cells that emerge in different points in development and come online. The connections between cells, they have an average strength that fluctuates across development. Sometimes you want cells there in development for a short period of time. Sometimes you want cells to turn on late. Sometimes you want connections to emerge late. And, sometimes it's wanted and sometimes it will just happen and it will affect the way the agent behaves. So there are a lot of considerations there that needs to be cleaned up because, it's kind of like there are a lot of questions that lead from that. For example, if I put a cell in an interneuron in this nervous system and I establish a connection, does that connection persist or not? In biological nervous systems, we know that a lot of connections will be born and then get pruned later in development, or that sometimes connectivity is delayed with respect to the emergence of tissues. So muscle will emerge and start twitching, and then it gets connected to the central nervous system later. Sometimes you have what they call, axon guidance, where axons come from motor neurons and they innervate target tissue. And if the target tissue is there, it gets innervated. If the neurons aren't there to innervate the target tissue dies. So there are a lot of biological analogs you can play with on this. And then, kind of get into a little part on Gibsonian information, which is something that may come out in the final version, but it's also something that may be very relevant to this. And I'm not really sure, but I think we should maybe talk about that if people are interested. Then there are these dual process models, which I've talked about, which is where you have not only this innate process, but this sort of cultural or social process that the agent experiences. And this can be something else that we can incorporate. And then there are a couple of analyses. There's a contingency analysis. These analyses are sort of, hypothetical. They're on pseudo data. They're on simulated data. So this just kind of talks about some of things like developmental contingency, which is where if you start from a certain point in development, and you constrain the system by, say, only having 3 or 4 cells emerge instead of 10, that affects the rest of the life history of the agent. So these developmental contingencies are very important. And, we can define those in development, and they follow the agent through its lifespan. And so, there are ways we can play with this. There are also different scenarios for the critical period and something we're calling developmental freedom. So this figure shows this relationship where you have a couple of stages in development of an agent. You have the morphogenesis where the body grows and the nervous system grows. So there's this formation period. Then there's this critical period where things start to get connected on that architecture. And then there's this period of developmental learning. So you get this morphogenesis where the basic morphology forms, the basic parts, the cells, the body parts, this sort of thing. Then you get this connectivity between those parts. So things initially get wired up. That's a critical period, because if you can play with that sort of initial connectivity, you can then affect later developmental learning. And so this developmental learning is defined by something called developmental freedom, which is this where, what happens during this critical period gets exploited in this period of like changing the weights of the network and things like that. So that's the diagram. And I know there are probably a lot of comments to make on this, but I'm just trying to kind of give you all of the sort of the logical flow of this. Then we have a part on feed-forward elements and cybernetic control. So these networks aren't only just kind of like interneurons and flows of information from sensor to effector, but we have these sort of elements that provide the potential for some sort of cybernetic control. And so it kind of goes through this. And then finally, there's this figure, and I think this is sort of towards the end, where we talk about agent developmental cognition, different scales. So an agent is released into the world, it gets developed, and then it becomes an adult, which isn't really a thing in agents, except that the agent can stick around for different periods of time. So the agent could be around for like seconds, if it's a computational agent, or, it could be around for hours, if it's exploring some space and it gets annihilated, like if it's exploring outer space or exploring a cavern in a, underground, or it could have a lifetime of days or months or even years. So it could be, tens to hundreds of years it could stick around. And so this is a timeline of like neural activity with respect to different scales of time. So, on very fast time scales, like 10 to the second seconds, we have neural activity. We have recognition. We have the operation of neural networks. 10 to the 6th, we have what we call a short coffee break, which is like a brief period of interaction where agents might meet up and start, exchanging information. At 10 to the 8th time, we have short-term memory consolidation in biological brains, so this is on the order of a couple hours. For 10 to the 10th, we have long-term memory consolidation for 1 day. So that's about a day. This is where you're living your life. Maybe there's a sleep period that's involved. And then, you have 10 to the 12th, which is 31 years. And this is where the agent needs to incorporate historical events into their repertoire, not just like things that they see or things that they're immediately interacting with. They need to have these historical timescales. And so these are all the things we need to think about when we think about agent cognition and these developing nervous systems. And there's no reason why the developmental period couldn't persist for years or persist to some offspring. And then this like lineage of developmental agents could last, hundreds of years. So we don't really know. There are different time scales that we have to think about. And so this lays us out in terms of lifespans, training times, naturalistic exploration of the environment, basic brain network and circuit function, or even a single stimulus presentation. So we have these different time scales we have to think about. So yeah, this just wraps it up, and then that's the overview of this paper. I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, and I wanted to kind of go over it, and because it's a range of topics that we have covered in the group, and we're kind of putting it together here in this document. It's an archive paper right now. There's a version of it that's out there, but we're going to update it probably majorly in the next several months. I've been meaning to come back to it, but I haven't had time, and we haven't really discussed it much. So if you're interested in contributing to it, please share your ideas, or we can, go do some collaborative editing or whatever.
Is there a link to it? Is it just in the Slack, or?
I will put it in the Slack, in the Developmental AI channel. So I think that's, I'll open up the editing and people can make comments or.
Yeah, because I'd love to look at it deeper to develop the ideas that I have about it that I can't quite formulate yet. Renewables in particular, just so fascinated in their relationship to cellular automata and other developmental processes like that. It's just like there's so much there. It's amazing.
I'm working. Are you?
No, just thinking.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I mean, super interesting. And I would like the link just because I need my glasses to read.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I'll put the link in the.
Yeah. I'd love to, and love to look at that.
Okay.
And the AL course that the continual learning course is still going on, and still learning lots. For those interested, it's really been.
All right.
Yeah, if I've been taking 2 or 3 other courses right now, I'd be there.
Okay. So we'll finish up with a paper or two. Let's see what we have in the chat. Okay. Oh yeah, Jesse says, I forgot how cool some of the work in this paper was. Glad to see it again. Yeah. So let me share my screen here. So we have some papers here. I'm not sure where I want to go. I think I know what I'll talk about. I was going to talk about this. We have these papers on the scope of cognitive science, but I'm going to cover that next week when Amanda can make it. Actually, I think I will talk about this one. Well, no. Okay, I'll talk about this one then. This is compositionality and cognitive modeling. So this is actually a paper from, I guess this is 1995, Philosophical Studies. We've been talking about large language models for a couple weeks, and we've been getting into that space and kind of discussing the cognitive science aspects of it. And we talked about compositionality, which is putting things together, especially like in language where you have, different rules that you need to put together, or different words you need to put together into sentences. And so this is something that is it has a long history in cognitive science, in compositionality, but not just in language, but also in cognitive models. So this is Keith Butler, and this is Philosophical Studies. So the introduction reads, the classical criticism of connectionist cognitive theory. So this connectionist cognitive theory is sort of the basis of neural networks. So back in the 80s, they first came up with these connectionist models, which are basically neural networks. They have these nodes, they have connections, and the connectivity is what gives you this sort of ability to make associations in the model and make outputs. And so this is what, this is the criticism of this theory. And I think we've talked about this in terms of like connectionism versus like symbolic models of different cognitive phenomena. So, connectionism doesn't rely on any one representation. It's just generating things. So the classical criticism is that it cannot adequately explain purported facts about cognition, such as the compositionality of mental representation. So it can't really it can't explain those things. It can just generate options. So we see that in neural networks. We see that in deep learning networks. It's generating predictions, it's generating classifications, but it's hard to really interpret those things or understand why the model is doing it. And there are also things with some symbolism which aren't really the purview of connectionist models. The reasons for thinking that mental representations are compositional derive from the purported compositionality of linguistic representation. So this whole idea of mental representations, we want to understand, what they're all about, and we think that they're compositional because linguistics is compositional. So linguistic representations are compositional, and other forms of representations are probably also compositional, or it's a good assumption at least to make if we want to really kind of replicate them and work with them. So I will draw on recent work in the philosophy of language that undermines this thesis that linguistic representations are mostly compositional. So this is actually a statement that says, actually, linguistics isn't compositional, that this isn't really a thing that's, So this in turn will have implications for the compositionality of mental representations, though not as straightforwardly as one might expect. As a result, I will not be arguing for the simple-minded claim that connectionists are not obliged to provide an account of the compositionality of mental representations. So, in other words, connectionists aren't off the hook. They still need to provide an account of compositionality. They still need to show their models just don't generate outputs. They need to have this sort of compositional aspect where the outputs can be composed into different things that make sense. Rather, I will argue that certain sorts of connectionist model, in contrast to classical models, are well positioned to account for the particular respects in which mental representations are not compositional in the way linguistic representations are. So he's breaking apart this assumption that mental representations are compositional, that they're not really the same thing as linguistic representations, that we can get by with some other type of compositionality or something else. I think I used the term merely compositional last time, and that was with respect to the contextual geometric structures. And why I say merely compositional is because there's much more to like symbolism and representation than just compositional aspects of them. But that's an aside here. The compositionality issue provides a reason to favor connectionist models of cognitive capacities, not a reason to abandon them. So back here in the 90s, people were thinking about these connectionist models. There's a huge debate in cognitive science as to whether these connectionist models are really the way to go, or the sort of the good old-fashioned AI symbolic models that emerged further back in time. So there is a debate as to what represents cognition best. And it's like he's making this sort of interesting argument that's not really in the mainstream of the debate at the time. But so he gets into this connectionist classical cognitivist debate. Much research in cognitive science is concerned to understand a given cognitive capacity in terms of simplified artificial models that exhibit that capacity. So basically, the idea of cognition is to create a model of what's going on in the mind and then use that as a way to generate, if you can generate something that looks like cognition, then that's a good model. And that's like if you can predict, say, a psychology experiment, then it's a good model. If you can't, then it's, maybe not so good. But, our understanding of that black box is still kind of limited, especially back then. So, cognitive capacities are generally characterized functionally as the ability to generate one representation as output based on input consisting of another representation. So this is generation of a deductive consequence from a set of premises. So this is, again, like you're generating an output based on maybe another representation. So you're generating some set of assumptions out of like some input representation of an object in nature, I guess. Connectionists construct models of cognitive capacities in terms of simple processing units connected to one another. So activation can spread to other units. This is the spreading activation idea in connectionism. Representations of these networks vary in style, but the activity of the units and their connections are the most important part here. Classical cognitivists, on the other hand, take syntactic computation as the paradigm. So you're computing on symbols and how they're assembled. Representations are structured in the way that sentences in a language are structured. And so this is where your debate lies. And then he gets into some of these arguments about compositionality. He draws from Fodor and Pilshin, which is a classic paper from the late 80s, where the argumental representations are compositional. And then they make the analogy with linguistics. And then Fodor and McLaughlin in 91, they provide a contrast to that, where they do not portray the relationship between systematicity and compositionality in the same way. They say that compositionality proposes an explanation of systematicity, which is where you have systematic representations and things like that. In point of fact, compositionality presupposes a particular explanation of systematicity, one given independently of compositionality. So that's where they're kind of making their assumption from, is this paper by Fodor and McLaughlin. So yeah, they kind of get into this debate. I don't want to get deeply into this debate because we don't have much time left here. But just, this is kind of, I'll put this paper in the Slack. You can read that over as well. And he kind of gets into this argument of making the case for the specific interpretation of this debate. And there's a lot here, but I think it's worth reading over. And it's, again, one of these old debates that's still relevant today. So.
I mean, this was the Gary Marcus meeting that was it the end of May?
Yeah.
In June, yeah. But it was focused on this compositionality and had these wonderful talks from linguists of finding problems in GPT-3 and things like that that really spoke to the problem in a nice concrete way with large language models today.
Yeah. Oh, this was the compositionality in AI, and I think we put a link to it in somewhere in the Slack, so maybe we can re-up that. Yeah, Barry Marcus' Substack.
We can bump it back up. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, linguistic models. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so that's, we had a bunch of things in the chat here. Jesse says, can someone link this compositionality paper in the Slack channel to the CogSci Methods project? I will do that. All right. Oh, Brian already did that. So which talks were these? Yeah, the ones with Gary Marcus. So, yeah. Okay. So anyone have anything they want to say before we go for this week?
Just that I love Fodor's quote, "With no computation without representation."
Yeah. Yep.
It's exciting to move into this, though. Keith Butler, this is fascinating.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for attending this week. Have anything you want to present next week, let us know, and we can put it on the schedule. Otherwise, we'll follow up on the third week of NeuroMatch and some other things to go. And hopefully Brian is doing, that'll be his last week in NeuroMatch. So good luck to you there.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm going to try to get something together, hopefully for next week, regarding the VSAT collective Parkinson stuff. I put this in my update, but I've kind of gotten stuck in all these eddies or all these kind of dead ends in the project. So I really want to move forward. Hopefully by next week.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, congrats, Brian, on making it through 2 weeks so far. And Sam, if you're still there, I think you are. I'll follow up with you about the interview stuff later today. No pressure to do it, but I think it'd be a cool thing. And I think everybody's working on some good stuff. So talk to you later.
Okay. Thank you.